Well, hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, which will close out the new model series for this term. And this is a series that's invited architects and other interdisciplinary practitioners to discuss how their work can change the models around which society is organized. Each event proposes a new model to address how we can shift power structures, socio-economic forces, and structural inequalities present in society today to give us new tools to rethink the world around us. Over the past two terms, a series of new models have been presented by practitioners across disciplines to ask how we need to redesign institutions, redress who has access to funding, celebrate the act of rehearsing the revolution, reverse the lack of representation in public art, embrace physical and digital spaces of collective care, find new forms of community-led practice, develop new ways to listen to stories, histories, and places, invent new forms of recognition, and address the interconnected crises threatening the future of our planet, with more to come as we proceed into the spring term. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Manijay Verghese. I'm the head of the AA's public program, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, who through her practice that spans curation and education, has worked with discursive and social frameworks to invent new forms of learning and spaces for learning, or actually what is better described as unlearning. So Sepake Angiama is the artistic director of the Institute for International Visual Art in London, where she works with artists who disrupt or provoke aspects of the social sphere through action, radical forms of pedagogy, and architecture. While in her position as the head of education at Documenta 14, she initiated the project Under the Mango Tree, which you can see on the screen, a self-organized gathering of unlearning practices. The second edition, Visva Bharati Santiniketan, brought together artist-led spaces, libraries, and schools interested in unfolding discourses around decolonizing education practices that destabilize the European canon through examining alternative epistemologies, notions of unlearning, and indigenous knowledge. The next edition will take place in Puerto Rico in 2022 with a focus on indigenous epistemologies, land-based learning, and craft. Previously, she was the head of education for Manifesta 10, hosted by the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and her research, Her Imaginary, addresses how science fiction, feminism, and social forms of architecture harness the perfect tools for a pedagogy to awaken a political and social imagination. So while I tried to summarize her bio, I felt like all of these were very important to contextualize tonight's lecture, so I had to read it all. And tonight she's going to discuss a new model for an old model, questioning how institutions of education can be transformed to unlearn transactional forms of knowledge and instead think about tools for self-education, decolonization, and hands-on experience through making and doing. So to quote her lecture description, she asks, how can the congregational, the coming together, the being with, produce new forms of learning which replenish and do not simply just extract? So before I hand over to Sepake, a few notes on the format. Sepake will give her lecture, and following that, I'll ask a few initial questions before opening it up to the audience for a wider discussion. But throughout the lecture, if you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat. And then when we open up to discussion, if you want to use the raise hand function, I can also unmute you to ask your question, or otherwise I can ask it on your behalf, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And in the discussion, if you also feel comfortable, it'd be great if you could turn your camera on so we can all feel like we're somehow together in the same space, even though we are currently all in our own homes and other spaces. So I'm really delighted to have Sepake here, both as part of this series and also tonight for this lecture. So please join me in welcoming her to the AA.
Oh, thank you, Manijay. So I'd like to, thank you for your patience and in organising this series of lectures. I think it's really going to be quite formative in us being able to sort of imagine a time beyond what we're in currently. So I am going to talk about Under the Mango Tree, more specifically the one that took place in Santiniketan last year. And at the same time, I'm going to sort of try to think about how some of the methodologies and approaches are things that could be potentially applied to thinking about institutions, and specifically I'd say cultural institutions and educational institutions, which are the ones that I predominantly work in. But one of the things I was just thinking about today was about the fact that in German there's no direct translation for meanwhile. And I don't know why, culturally there isn't a translation for meanwhile or the need for meanwhile. But it really made me think about this time, it was the beginning of February. So meanwhile, in other places in the world, lots of other things were kind of going on, obviously in terms of the kind of the way in which the kind of pandemic kind of grew. But that was one of the last opportunities I had for sort of coming together with others, with other practitioners, with other thinkers. So I think the other notion, apart from the meanwhile, I think there's also another idea around the elsewhere. So the meanwhile and the elsewhere are descriptions for speculative time and space for me. They're not in space or a time continuum, but they're kind of entangled or enmeshed configurations of time that are potentially bending or melting or slowing down. And I think very much about the elsewhere also in relation to the general idea of the here and the there. And when I'm talking about the here and the there, I'm really talking about a kind of crossover in a political and a geopolitical and a social time. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I think in terms of like how sort of science fiction has really sort of shaped the way that I think about pedagogy and kind of the kind of tools that we need for the future. I think science fiction allows for a kind of an expansion of thinking through time and an expansion of thinking through space. In a way that is not necessarily limited by our current social political circumstances. And this project under the mango tree was in some way an opportunity to look at an old model, but you'll notice the title for this talk, a new model for an old model, was recognizing that sometimes old models kind of evolve and move into, so radical forms can actually turn into quite conservative forms. And that's something that I definitely saw in the process of looking at specific kinds of practices and wanting to see what was the root of that practice. And the whole, I think, strategy and methodology of thinking about looking at the root is for me a kind of radical practice, because radical means, of and pertaining to the root. So in order to think through where a lot of my ideas around conviviality as a tool for education and for learning, notions around intimacy and collaboration, for me, it was really important to think about where was the place, what was the site for where these ideas originated from. Okay, so what are the ideas that govern the way in which we relate to one another? What creates the social relationships that exist between parents and children, between governments and citizens, between the doctor and their patients, between teachers and their students? Not only people, but in relation to other entities. How do we characterize the set of relations between institutions and art, between architecture and values, between institutions and production? Over the last year, it has been interesting to see how we have functioned outside of the space of cultural institutions. It has made me think about where is the site of cultural and culture, what is the site for knowledge production, and what have we gained from spending so much of our time within domestic settings? Well, for sure, one aspect of my work which has found a central position is a focus on well-being, on care, and on mental health. Another aspect of being isolated and working remotely has had to consider, how do we communicate with others? How do we collaborate? It's also been a difficult year for many of us who've had to suffer loss one way or another, perhaps a loss of a loved one, but also a loss of sociability, of coming together and of intimacy, of passing conversation on the street, of the unplanned and unexpected. And this is something I rely on so much in my work. I talk of intimacy here in the context of education practices as an opportunity to get close to others, to be able to voice and to listen, a true space of exchange, although those spaces also require a good amount of time, patience, and vulnerability. So much of my practice relies on intimacy, but one thing I have enjoyed is reading to others, and even over the phone or online, the quality of hearing and listening to others reproduces a kind of space that is almost felt. Today I'm going to speak using a number of different registers, flowing between poetry and texts that I have written and written by others, using my experience in different situations as my primary source. We sometimes fail to trust our own experience and our own voice, but this is a practice as we continue to experience and we find articulation of language and this movement between doing something, reading out loud, reading collectively, writing, and further conversations is a continual flow of movement which forms the discourse that we are engaged with. But I'm also going to reflect on practices of artists and pedagogues and those who have influenced my thinking and doing. She wanted to talk about circles, about forms that go around and come around, about circular forms that ripple, that return, that revolt and resonate, that curve, about bottoms and bellies and soft curvature and form, that pleasing line that returns on itself, like the cupping of clay and how a ball feels in your hand. Open circles with fissures and breaks and spaces for more. The shape that our bodies make when they are fetal, curling up into a ball when in fear, or feeling sick or wanting to make yourself small. She wanted to think about the form we make in the womb, the proximity between two bodies, the roundness of bowls, of columns, and the seduction of a curved wall, of a curved corner, of curved things, that line that goes around and comes around, that rolls, that repels, that rebounds, that relates. A circle, a round, relenting circle, a line that goes around and comes around, that revolts, that repels, that spins, that resonates, that ripples, that responds, that returns, that rattles, that goes around and comes around, that responds to the sound, that echoes, that rebounds, that line that would rather continue along its way, a revolution of sorts. Circles are very important for Under the Mango Tree, a gathering of artist-initiated schools, libraries, and spaces of unlearning, of decolonisation, an unravelling of thought, a thinking through bodies while resonating with other bodies. Form a circle. That's how the first gathering began. Sanchayan asked us to form a circle in front of the Friedrichianum under a tree planted by Joseph Beuys. Instead of mango trees, our walk through the park was lined with oak trees. They were planted by Beuys and transformed the city. Rabindranath Tagore was perhaps thinking of another way to transform our bodies in space, planting mango seeds into the dry terrain of Sankirtan, to form classrooms, bodies of thought finding shade under the mango tree. The untangled roots of the gathering under the mango tree gleaned its inspiration from many radical pedagogical thinkers and spatial art education practices. Rabindranath Tagore, Lina Bo Bardi, Paulo Freire, Ivan Illich, as well as bringing together 10 schools, initiatives, and libraries whose practices derive from such radical lineage. The etymology of the word radical, as I mentioned, it was drawn to my attention, Emmanuel Pratt, who I worked with actually at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. The word radical is of and pertaining to the root. So when we talk of radical education practices, we think of practices and writing that aim to challenge, uproot, and destabilize conservative forms of institutionalized learning. We see learning as active, constantly shifting and evolving, exhausting, and yet very much alive. The practices brought together from very different geographies share the struggle against banking knowledge-based forms of exchange and strive for biophilic rather than the necrophilic education. Unlearning transactional forms of knowledge as though the student is an empty vessel collecting wisdom from the master, and instead attempt to identify the tools needed to pursue self-education, to decolonise, to embody, to experience, to make and do. Coming from the etymology of education to draw out and lead forth, how can the congregational, the coming together, the being with, produce, I've lost my place. Coming together, the being with, produce new forms of learning which replenish and not simply extract. As one of the contributors to Under the Mango Tree, Jorge Gonzalez, who will host the next edition in Puerto Rico, described to me, how do we construct other forms of we? Instead, the mango tree, which is delicious fruit, a seductive smell, and the sight of learning that allows us to activate all our senses for learning with each other. The first of these images being Santiniketan, the abode of peace, the Nobel Prize writer and poet Rabindranath Tagore, whose father bought 20 bihas of land from the landlord of Raipur near Bulpur, 150 kilometers from the city of Kolkata, West Bengal in India, and built a garden house and named it Santiniketan, a perfect place for meditation and contemplation within nature. After his father established Santiniketan as a spiritual center in 1863, Rabindranath explored the idea of an experimental school in 1901, which began with an equal number of teachers and students and called it a place, and later on it became a university in 1921. The motto of the university speaks to Tagore's vision of a global village, where the whole world can find a nest, which follows the idea of education as a holistic field in which teacher and student work together in a circle of communal learning under the shade of mango groves. Rabindranath's idea was to devise a curriculum that creates harmony with all existence, in which its roots dug deep in connecting with the locality, but its resonance and attraction would stretch far beyond the remote, lush greens and red soil of the locality. An education that grew out of an open-air classroom and a connection to nature, and an indignant turn away from the shut-in classrooms and the European models of exam-driven frontal learning, which he felt stifled his own learning. A celebration of seasonality rather than religious rituals, an awakening of the senses which embraced expression through the arts. She is our own, the darling of our hearts, Santiniketan. Our dreams are rocked in her arms. Her face is a fresh wonder of love every time we see her. For she is our own, the darling of our hearts. In the shadows of her trees we meet, in the freedom of her open sky. Her mornings come and her evenings bringing down heaven's kisses, making us feel anew that she's our own, the darling of our hearts. The stillness of her shades is stirred by the woodland whisper. Her Amalaki groves are a quiver with the rupture of leaves. She dwells in us and around us, however far we may wander. She weaves our hearts in a song, making us one in music, tuning our strings of love with her own fingers. And we ever remember that she is our own, the darling of our hearts. Tagore is often described as a polymath. He becomes well known in Europe as a poet, and his first from India, or indeed from a non-European descent, to gain recognition through his poetry and writing, gaining him a Nobel Prize, as it is translated, Song Offerings. What is most striking about Tagore is what he does with the prize money from winning the prize. He takes this money to invest it back into the school. He believed the students should not have to pay for their education, and that they should experience a freedom to learn, not hindered by this concern. This meant much of the travel and lectures that Tagore gave internationally were an ongoing support and upkeep for the running of the school. Before we gathered in Santiniketan, the women from the close-by village prepared the ground for the registration. I'm just going to pop back to that image. They drew a large circle in the ground and leavened the earth in a circular motion. They used the same method that women do to finish the dwellings in the area, using a mixture of cow dung and sand. Over the next couple of days, it dried, while they also prepared a place for cooking and eating together. This was the second edition of Under the Mango Tree, the first taking place in Athens and Kassel. But Santiniketan had been the inspiration. The invitation from Sanchayan Ghosh, the head of painting department at the art school, came at the end of the first edition. He attended the first edition and considered that another gathering would commemorate the 100th year of the school. The art school was founded in 1919, in the same year that Bauhaus was formed. And Bauhaus training in the foundation year found the importance and relation between the body, movement, and creative force. But today I'm not going to talk about the Bauhaus, but I wanted to just bring those two moments together, just in terms of thinking about the meanwhile and the elsewhere. So I saw that the schools, libraries, and initiatives that we brought together recognize their practices as extensions of their own thinking and process of learning. So this, what you can see here is, so you saw the image before, which was the ground being prepared, and this was the Alpana registration process that was initiated by Sanchayan Ghosh. It's a collective process of re-engaging with Alpana, which is a process of mapping body space relationships to determine a self-organized process of registration. Alpana is a traditional ritualistic drawing process of Bengal incorporated into a formal discipline of art as a process of fine lines. And what happened here is that each of the people that were stood in the circle and who were going to participate in that 5-day school, they took on the responsibility of registering somebody else by drawing an outline around their shadow, and then somebody else did the same for them. So that was really, the kind of process of saying that we're here together. And so it looks like a kind of a set of entangled lines. But I really loved this as a kind of process for registration. It became a kind of beginning ritual to the process of registration, of individual participation of the workshops. And it's quite interesting for me because while I was in Germany, we, as part of Documenta, we worked with the Kunsthochschule in Kassel. And one of the protests actually from the students was around registration. not wanting to have to say that they were present. And I found that quite interesting, because I didn't see it as something that would be conflictual, but I think the students felt that it was a form of surveillance. And what I found here, that this form of registration was almost like a kind of commitment to each other. And it was a kind of registering of interest, but also a kind of registering of kind of multiple bodies being together in the same space over a duration of time. And it's actually, I think, subsequently really very much changed my idea about thinking about what does it mean to actually register someone? What does it mean to not only to register someone, but what does it mean to speak on multiple registers? What does it mean to be present in different registers? And how does the formation of the circle and also this form of registration, what does it tell you, or what does it not tell you? So what are the kinds of acts of surveillance which are sort of taken away through this process of registration? How can you think through the body if you have spent years being conditioned to think that to listen is to sit still? To be attractive is not to fidget, and to focus, to be attentive, not attractive. To be attentive is not to fidget, and to focus the eye on the one who's listening. Through my time as a teacher, I found that using the hands to concentrate on something else generates another way of being together. The nature of the conversation and the dialogue shifts. The haptic allows for a connection to others that is not pressured and flows, allowing for silences and chatter. Another thing within my schooling that I was discouraged from doing was talking. And I like to talk a lot. Talking was my way of understanding what the task was at hand. If I knew how to do something, the pleasure of showing others how to do it was too much for me to resist the opportunity. In my schooling, was not encouraged to speak out. I was encouraged to stay silent, because as far as the teachers were concerned, if I was silent, I was receptive. And while silence has its uses, it's important to know that speaking has its uses too. Not only to demonstrate knowledge, but also as a form of transmission and translation, expression, and to enter into a dialogue. Potentially, it's in the speaking that understanding is consolidated, but we are not encouraged to enter into dialogue with those who teach us. The role of the teacher is to teach, and the student should therefore soak up what is being taught. And so I think I've been thinking a lot about the voice and the uses of the voice, and not only as a kind of audible voice, but also as an internal landscape. So the voice inside, the one that's kind of almost speaking while others are speaking. So I'm just going to read a short piece that I kind of wrote around that before continuing with other aspects of Under the Mango Tree. A voice, a small voice speaks. A small voice speaks from within her, and she doesn't move her lips. Remaining very still, she listens to hear if the voice will speak again. She only hears her breath this time as her chest rises and falls. She becomes aware of the noises that surround her. The repetitive trill of an early Sunday morning bird, and the dry, dragging sound of the wheels of a car as it drives up the hill. One sound of a church bell and a cry of a small child, creating the setting of a quiet Sunday morning. But this voice that spoke from within her, spoke so softly, clearly, without confusion, and with perfect clarity. It's time to wake up. She would often wake up to her inner voice trying to make sense of the world. solving problems from the day before, resolving arguments, creating solutions and making plans. Her inner voice was quietest at night and always awoke early. The cacophony of too many voices from the events of the days passed through her, but in the morning, there were very few sounds to challenge her inner voice. Get up. There is so much to do today. She takes in another breath, focuses on the blue sky, and awaits further instruction. Closing her eyes, she realizes how much her inner voice sounds like her own voice. Pondering on how she could hear it, she becomes stuck in her thoughts. Did she train herself to hear the voice? Upon reflection, perhaps the voice had always been there. The insanity of possessing another voice speaking from within was most likely developed while in school, or from trying to hear the voice of God while at church. When writing and reading, pupils of her school were asked to work in silence. Only the scratching of carbon pencils on paper and the flipping of pages to be heard. She had struggled with reading in silence and had trouble identifying different voices and narrative texts. She often couldn't tell who was speaking. This did not stop her from trying to decipher the voices, for the words on the page would remain as encoded symbols without the articulation of the voice. Who was speaking? Was it the writer, or had they crafted another narrator? The narrator in her mind should be neutral and without bias. This was also why she struggled to follow a story being read to her. While the reader subtly reflected the nuances of the text, the articulation of the words from the page, pushing up from the diaphragm, the air squeezing past the tongue, the teeth, crashing a wave of sound that oscillates mid-air until they reverberate around the skin of the outer ear, spiraling down into the inner ear, cocooning the sound into 3 connecting bones, surrounded by a balancing liquid. The information traveled to the brain to decode the sound symbols as something meaningful, attacking like rapid gunfire the manipulation of sound into a language of meaning. But instead of following the flow of words, she would drift and converse with her own inner voice. One word or a sentence acting as a trigger. I am often asked the question, how do you unlearn? What does it mean to unlearn? Well, for me, it was a journey that began in trying to recognize my voice. When I talk about my voice, I talk about the consolidation between inner and that of the outer or the outward expression. This is often something that we struggle to do. And for much of our education, it's about guiding this outward expression. But I think that very much of what I think is the fundamentals of unlearning is recognizing that often we are not at the center of our own story. Our voice can often be dissented. That is the root of many grassroots movements whose continual struggle are galvanizing change. What could it possibly mean to dissenter whiteness from our education, to recognize the value of other knowledges? What could it mean to rupture this space, to no longer tell the story of the one that we name as the victor, but to listen to the voices that have been for so long marginalized, silenced, othered, or even erased? When I think of this question, I also think so much about non-human life. A number of practices that I am inspired to consider is also sort of thinking about land-based learning and land-based education, central to the formation of a design of coming together. To come under the shade of the mango tree with such deliberateness and to experience the fulfillment of solitude, emphasize my need for communion. While I am physically alone, proves that I understand the essentiality to be with. Through Under the Mango Tree, our shared or collective aim was to share and broaden our understanding and knowledge of artistic initiatives critically positioned outside of the Western canon. Is it possible to transform old structures into new ones? We were interested in collective forms of knowledge production, centering other forms of knowledge, or in some cases, indigenous forms of knowledge, as well as finding ways of creating a non-hierarchical setting. In preparation, we looked at a text written by Frere from his text, The Pedagogy of the Heart. As he sits under the mango tree in solitude, he recognizes the value of what it means to be with. As well as sharing practice, what we discovered is that through the workshops and the moments of gathering, we were also practicing what it meant to be with, and that togetherness is not a given. When you stand in a circle for the first time with a group of people that you do not know, you are not together. You are not yet a group. You have not found your common ground, even if you are all drawn to be in one place at one time. You are a group of individuals. What I have learned is that togetherness is a practice that requires time, demands attention and focus, and requires active listening, not only to others, but also to yourself. And it's through this back and forth exchange that a connection is forged. And I think that I sort of mentioned about intimacy at the beginning of this talk. The interesting thing for me about, reading or speaking and listening is that it often produces a kind of space that requires an intimacy. It requires a closeness. And I think after the first Under the Mango Tree, I sort of started a set of workshops called Reading Out Loud. And it was based really on the idea that libraries were known to be loud spaces because we had not really developed the technology of reading silently. And so in understanding that, libraries were these spaces which was, complete cacophony of sound, I was really interested in that relationship, not only to reading, but also to the body and what that did in relation to others. And I think that one of the, aspects of course of the text that I read from Frere, sort of saying, while being alone, physically alone, proves that I understand the essentiality to be with. Of course, that's something that's been, I've been thinking a lot about over the last year, while we've all been sort of isolated, and not the sort of possibility of being able to kind of, be physically in space with other people is often something that's like lost. And I'm looking forward to, I guess, reclaiming that space because, quite early on at the beginning of this lockdown, I was kind of asked about, your work is sort of really centered around, intimacy and gathering and coming together. And actually, even in the Chicago Architecture Biennial, I was also looking for practices that that either kind of created those temporary communities or were in some way trying to institute those communities and ways of coming together through kind of spatializing of a pedagogy. And I sort of feel that while there's an awful lot to learn from this time of being able to kind of operate still within our kind of domestic settings and the kind of knowledge that's being produced in these spaces. But it really has actually, for me, made me really realise the importance of having institutional settings, having other kinds of spaces that maybe regulate in some ways the kinds of knowledges which are being produced. And I think as we move back or not necessarily back, but maybe into, so towards spaces of gathering, spaces of coming together again, I think I will be really, I guess, attentive to creating that quality of a space and where people can really listen, but also be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sepake. It was really moving, actually, to just hear you speak about so many things, actually. And I'm really glad that your lecture kind of happened now, because it actually connected so many different strands that we'd been talking about over the course of the series, from listening to collaborative practice to ways of recognizing other forms of knowledge and coming together. And it was just like you created a really amazing intimate space during the course of your lecture to actually think through things. And you can see some of the comments in the chat that actually reiterate that. So really, thank you so much. And I really, I feel that there was an article, I think, written for the Architecture Foundation a few months ago on how everyone was using the word radical to suggest a kind of break from what was happening right now. And actually hearing you speak about it, about a return to origin or a return to the root, was a completely different way of thinking about it. And it really changed my attitude actually to that word. And I guess like so many of the things you talked about really showed that, I mean, it made me question actually the naming of this whole series, in that, I wanted to I've asked everyone to come up with a new model. And I like how in you talking about the new model, you're actually returning to the origins of like education, and how sometimes the best ideas are maybe embedded in those old models that we cast aside too quickly, or we need to now return to. So maybe to start the discussion, and just as a reminder to everyone, please post your comments in the chat or raise your hand, and I would love to have everyone participate in this after such a rich lecture. But to start, I wanted to ask you, I think what's really interesting about the Under the Mango Tree project is how you tested that out in now, I guess, a few different locations, and with more to come. And given that, I guess, Tagore was thinking about a more localized form of education, or ways to rethink the institution specific to a context, how did you feel that model adapted to, I guess, being held in Germany, being held in India, or being held in the future in Puerto Rico? And what are the ways in which that changes each time?
Yeah, so I think one of the ideas that I didn't really sort of pick up on before going to Saint Nikitan was that Tagore was not necessarily, he was not interested in these notions of nationalism, of these kind of borders of, and that he was really, this idea of this nest was one, yes, of culture sort of influencing different kinds of practices sort of coming into the school. And he himself was very active in traveling to many different places, and actually luring people to come to Santa Nikitan to share also their practices. So I think at the heart of it, I think recognizing pedagogy as a form of exchanging and sharing knowledge. And I think what's really, I don't know if that came across enough in maybe what I was saying, but I guess what the other thing I really sort of took away was how the form or the format dictates the kinds of knowledge that might be produced, and also informs the kinds of social relation between, I sort of talked about relations between people, but also relationships between nature and actually the project the image that I used for the promotion of this talk was the work of Dharmendra Prasad, who actually, formerly was trained as a painter, And he kind of, in conversation with him, I was really sort of struck by his interest in, speaking to the landscape, like, speaking to other entities. He told me once that he'd made a painting for the sea. And so he took this painting into the sea to introduce this painting. And I remember just thinking that's so impractical, as an idea. But I think what's really transformed or transpired in his practice is that this idea of being able to really, I guess, engage with the context and the site specificity. Well, I can never say that word. Site specificity. And that's what he brought to Santiniketem, because I thought that was really interesting because, it's a place which often talks about the importance of nature, but actually he felt that there was not really the opportunity to engage directly with it. So he took the students completely away from the school into a kind of, he was on a sort of farmland away from actually other buildings, really. And they sort of forged this space together, but he really wanted to think through, tree as a form of time, for example, or he really felt that that while we might say, a connection with nature while looking through a window, wasn't the kind of conversation or dialogue that he wanted to have. So, so I've learned, I think, an awful lot about how you might situate a practice in order to produce certain kinds of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I'm glad you brought up that link between form and format, because that was something I was quite interested in as well, in terms of the form of the circle and then the format of education or intimacy or togetherness that it produced. And I really loved the reading you did about how just being in the circle didn't make you a group, but it was like the process of like what happened in that circle that made you a group. And I don't know, I guess there's something you talked about the meanwhile and the elsewhere at the beginning, and these kinds of more fluid or flexible forms that the institution like currently is like very static and needs to adopt or be reinvented to embrace. And I was quite curious as to how that intangible, like the stuff that happens once you put people in this form, like how that's captured and passed on and transmitted between groups of people and like, I guess, humans and non-humans, because I thought what you said about nature was also really interesting.
So one of the things that came about, I think, also from that notion of being together or being with, or was also, for example, in the school that they were sort of split in different disciplines, which is quite usual, like sculpture, painting, printmaking. And I think when we first came, we were not really interested in the divisions between these disciplines, and there was a little bit of resistance to the idea that a painting student would have anything to say to a sculpture student. Like, what is it that they could potentially do together that could be generative or useful? And I think that, I suppose this is also part of I guess my sort of positioning of being much more of a generalist. So like, being interested in lots of different practices and just thinking about what they lend to each other, or what kind of space that produces. And so when I sort of talk about that practice of being together, we did, Sunshine actually led quite a lot of really interesting kind of theatre games that sort of break down some of the sort of boundaries, but where those boundaries were being broken down was through dialogue and through conversation. And actually dialogue and conversation that was not predicated on disciplines. So it wasn't that, that the students presented their practice, but we talked about other things that might inform their practice that potentially the school didn't necessarily have a space for those things to be shared. So, for example, Nikolai Olenikov from the School of Engaged Art from St. Petersburg his workshop was a very simple workshop, but extremely kind of powerful in terms of he asked the students every day to tell their news, and their news being something that's happening in the world that's affecting them directly or personally. And what was really interesting was specifically, I think at the time that we were in India, was also just really understanding the complexity of sort of different histories and narratives and how they form very specific subjecthoods. Even within that school, it was like a kind of, microcosm of what was going on a much wider scale. And I feel as if what we started to see was that is at the beginning, when everyone was quite formal in the way that they said hello, or how they interacted with each other. Obviously, I mean, it was only a very short period of time, but by the end of the week, I mean, we were like singing around in circles, or those things where you have to overcome your own vulnerability, and that's what I mean by in terms of expression and the importance of being able to do that, I think, and to talk about those things which are on the inside, that are part of your inner world, and I think being able to share that, it does produce a quality of space that I think is really, really important for any form of transformative practice or pedagogy.
Definitely. And I think that's amazing that people were singing and had felt comfortable enough to share so much after just a short amount of time. I could ask you questions all night, so I guess I wanted to just check if anyone had any questions that they'd like to ask. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you so that you can ask your question. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
But I mean, I guess just one thing I just wanted to, because I did say I was going to reflect on that a little bit. I suppose there are methodologies and approaches that I try to take out of Under the Mango Tree and think about how to apply them within, effectively, like I'm going from a very kind of that was a very rural setting to, London, which is a very urban setting, and obviously the infrastructure of institutions does formalise and regulate our bodies in a certain way, and I'm trying to think whether are there things that need to be undone, and that's what I'm sort of thinking about in terms of unlearning. Are there things within the spaces that dictate the way in which we behave, learn, live, and if there are things which are oppressive or that are suppressing our voice or our ability to be able to communicate, those are the things that I'm interested in kind of breaking down, because I mean, often it feels as if it's invisible, but they are. Some of those things are there. Oh, manager, I can't hear you. Oh, right.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. We have a question from Jean, who I'll ask to unmute.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I put into the chat that, and you've just confirmed it, that I think your unlearning and decolonising unworks the punitive, the cop within and the cop outside. And it's, in that sense, I think it's profoundly abolitionist. I think, all the work that's being done, led by Angela Davis on abolition, I think that, I think what you're doing is a very, very profound way of thinking that in terms of pedagogy and space. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jean.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that whole model for unlearning, or I guess questioning, like what makes us feel more present, was something that really struck me in your presentation, when you talked about how if we use our hands, we feel more connected, both to the environment we're in, but also to each other. And I guess my next question was more about how that space of intimacy you talked about from the circle translates into this weird situation we find ourselves right now, where we're doing everything through screens. And because it's something like as a teacher of architecture, like I've struggled with, because it's the space in between those formal moments of education that actually makes teaching come to life, like where you make jokes or have banter or chat to your students. And I really miss that, because this feels very formal. Like you can't even cut in on someone speaking, because like these platforms don't allow for that. But I remember at the beginning of lockdown, you did this amazing set of like Facebook Lives where you would read out loud, and you, I think, asked people to like nominate 10 books to read as well, and it created a kind of movement of people doing that. And I found that really, I mean, I listened to loads of them because I found it just really soothing and reassuring to just listen to someone read to you and read texts that they found important. And I think once you're an adult, you don't often find people like reading to you. And I think that's maybe also why we like podcasts so much.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. I mean, so at the beginning of lockdown, I guess we were all, we all probably did a similar thing. And I suppose it is a question about how do you respond in a crisis, isn't it? And I suppose one of the things you do is look for others that you can kind of maybe be in solidarity with, or that help you, comfort yourself. And where I go to books. And it's interesting, as you mentioned about Angela Davis, I often went specifically to radical Black feminists who I felt had undergone tougher times than myself. And I thought, well, how did they get through those times? And I think one of the things I was really touched by also was Audre Lorde sort of talking about how, the kind of, in a way, a sort of politics of poetry, and how poetry can move people. It's almost like thinking about it as a form of activism, thinking about it as something that kind of affects your corpus, and can actually also bring people together. And I felt that, like, if I was going to read as a kind of medicine to soothe myself in this time, and I guess that's also what I meant by the kind of melting and bending of time, because obviously those texts have been written in different times where other things are happening and they're responding to very different things. Like, if I could use those words to comfort me in this moment, maybe they would also comfort others. And I also really love, to be honest, like listening to what other people had selected and what books they were reading. So it was this kind of, and in a way, it's a kind of library, it's a sort of an extended but activated, library, or not kind of orality that was, So I feel that although I don't really believe you can truly, reconfigure our digital space in order to do what I think the thing of being in space, in a place with other bodies, I don't think you can necessarily reconfigure that online. You can do lots of things that you can Zoom. I suppose the chat function sort of functions as the kind of photocopier conversation potentially. But I was actually thinking if anyone had actually mapped whether it was possible to use the data from Zoom to kind of map, those conversations, who's involved in them, and actually did it create more interconnectivity internationally, or, where were those conversations taking place? I would love to see that. But I think, for one thing, actually, what it really helped with was science fiction writing, actually, I have to say. That was even better because the situation was so unbelievable, but you could draw from aspects of it because it felt so surreal. So that's the only great thing that's come out of this time for me, specifically, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that idea that fiction can be soothing, because, like, especially science fiction, because it like almost transports you, but it also, I think a lot of it is like it's so speculative that you can almost look back on the present, or feel as though you can reflect on something that you at the moment you don't have distance to understand right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess part of what I really miss about physical interaction, like other than I guess the banter and the informality that comes with that, is I think when you're on a screen, there's so much there's so many different stimuli to distract you, and it's very hard to focus. And like going back to my point about podcasts, like I can't actually focus on a podcast if I listen to it inside while I'm doing something. I have to go on a walk or like do something with my body so that I focus on what I'm listening to. Otherwise, the audio goes in and I don't focus. And I think this, so much of our society right now is driven by parameters of efficiency and multitasking and doing as much as possible. And that I miss that moment of just being in the lecture hall and like listening to the lecture and not, or, participating in a lecture and not just being distracted by all the messages and other things I need to do. And I think that's what really struck me by your talk. I think also because you mixed in the readings with the lecture, and it was really nice that it was a kind of part performance, part reflection. And I thought that the format of the talk actually manifested a lot of what you were, of the projects that you'd been working on.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the desire. I mean, I suppose the other thing that becomes really clear for me in terms of thinking about, space is the importance of, what would it mean if we design space solely for the act of conversation and for dialogue? So like what you sort of just mentioned about, distractions. So sort of taking away like visual distractions in order to either center the voice or center dialogue and conversation. I just think there are certain spaces that are able to do it so well, but it's so interesting for me, like when if you don't sort of design intersectionally in a way, like if you design for a gallery space to hang work, but you don't think about the kind of conversation that might happen in and around that work, then there's something lost. So I think there's such a great potential. And actually, I was looking at some sort of pedagogies of choreographers and dancers who were teaching, I think, an architecture program in Princeton. I was just so interested in thinking about that relationship to the body. So like if you start with the body, if you start with the voice, or if you start with dialogue, or you think about what is the thing you're actually trying to create or produce, which might not be, it might not be as easy as thinking about, like, for example, in terms of design of schools, like my primary school was a Victorian primary school. So their idea was like, you need to make the windows high. And so if you keep the windows high, it means the students are not distracted because they're not looking outside the window and seeing what's going on. I had actually had an old Victorian desk, like you can lift your stuff and you put all your things inside it. But they were really awkward. You couldn't really move them. So just the idea of like trying to get people together, if you had group work or partner work, they weren't very practical. So it's just, I think that's something I really love. That's one of the things I love thinking about with architects and with practitioners generally, is thinking about how you kind of disrupt space in order to produce another kind of quality of space and how that might be done. Innover is situated actually in an old barracks, effectively. I mean, it's now the University of the Arts Chelsea, but it was a barracks building. So there's a parade ground, in the middle of all of this kind of quadrant, in the middle of all of these buildings. And I'm often thinking about how can we disrupt that space? What is the way that you might perform it differently in order to, produce another kind of quality? I mean, I would love to be able to, in the future, think about specifically, architecture commissions for us to think about the kind of extension of a program of things that we can't physically do at the moment within the library, the Stuart Hall Library at Innover, so that we can have certain kinds of conversations or do certain kinds of activity which are not necessarily that you could not necessarily do currently now, because it feels like a parade ground. That's what it was designed for. It was a space that you're supposed to march across or be in formation. So and I just love the potential that architecture has to do that as well. So watch this space, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, that's really exciting. I'm conscious of time, and I have one more question maybe to ask, which is really about this idea of the voice. And I really liked how you took the piece of writing that you read out about her voice and like where that voice is situated, but also how you spoke about how through speaking, you consolidate your knowledge. And too often the kind of traditional model of learning is about just being spoken to rather than speaking. And I was curious as to like that as like an oral tradition of knowledge, or like how you actually absorb knowledge. And when you were talking about your primary school, I was thinking of the school I went to in India, and it was really interesting because it was started by a British woman who moved to India, but she was trying to, the Indian education system hadn't evolved from like colonialism, so a lot of it was about memorization, and so she was trying to bring in this model which was about understanding and but also trying to, I guess, hybridize that with the fact that there was an amazing climate and we shouldn't be inside classrooms and we should be in courtyards or under trees. And so it was a kind of a mixture of the things you're talking about, like the old institution, the colonial institution, and what she was trying to create with the decolonized institution, or the kind of original form of education. But it was like a very weird hybrid. Like we were wearing like flannel trousers in the heat of India and like trying to look like these British school children, but like in this tropical environment. But it was it was really interesting to reflect on. And because so much of that model was about trying to get students to like absorb knowledge in their own way and to reflect on it and to not just memorize things and forget them immediately. Mm-hmm. And so I was just curious, I thought maybe to have you reflect more on that voice and kind of in creating a new model out of the old model, how do we bring back that voice in education?
Yeah, gosh, that's a big question to end on, Manisha, but I will try. So, I mean, just one small thing I wanted to say was that an artist friend of mine had actually also told me about, there was an open air school model in the UK. I think there was, it was also health related, but it was quite interesting to see how, because of sort of a need in relation to health, that they kind of started to kind of think about much more open air classrooms and how you design for that. I mean, obviously, very different climate here than in India, but you know, I was curious to think what happened to that model, because you know it feels as though. And I suppose it's something else that's happening now, that, you know, schools, obviously, it's much more to do with security, that schools feel very cut off, you know, they don't necessarily that sense of opening out. But in relation to the voice, I mean, basically, it took me a while to work out that through my education, when you're, you know, whatever you're reading, there's sometimes I would have a slight, you know, you might sort of think about it as a kind of critical way of reading something. You're reading something and you're told that that's kind of fact, or that's, you know, that is the narrative, and but you sort of feel that your narrative doesn't chime with what you're reading, and so you try to take it in. It's almost like swallowing somebody else's voice, and then you realise after some time like either the impact of feminism didn't go broad or far enough, meaning that, you know, I've actually swallowed a kind of male perspective on the world. And not only that, it's also very, you know, it's very much class related as well. And actually potentially that figure that you've swallowed, or the voice that you've swallowed, doesn't necessarily come from a culturally diverse background either. So it took me a while to work out that it was important to listen a bit more to this kind of either critical voice or this thing that questioned everything, because that was probably where my voice was located. It was located in the questions. It was located in the kind of head tilt where you think, oh no, I don't know if I really agree with that. I don't think that's, so, and following that is so often seen as a kind of unruly behavior in a way, because it's like, there is a sense of orderliness in education, right? You don't really want to go into the mess of multiple voices and multiple perspectives. You just want to sort of almost this notion of, and these are the facts, let's stick to the facts. But actually what I find incredibly important in recognizing my own self-education was that to listen to the voice, to listen to that inner voice, was also to develop a sense of critical thinking and in critical engagement with the world. And that's when things get exciting.
I mean, I think that is a really inspiring note to kind of close this lecture. And I don't know, I found the whole talk really inspiring, and it's given me so much to think about in terms of like where education is going and what we need to do to like bring back our own voices. And to encourage that in our students as well. And I guess I think that process of unlearning is something continuous as well. That I've really noticed that there's so much like kind of conditioning or things that I assumed I questioned, but I almost have taken for granted or sit at the back of my mind that I'm still questioning. And so, I think that process is really interesting. I see Saskia has a question, so maybe if you don't mind taking another question.
That's fine.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was just really charming and essential. I think less of a question and more just a corroboration that the idea of asking questions and not being afraid to ask questions is essential for all of us. And I think I just really enjoyed the way you spoke, how you spoke, the porosity of the way that you invite people to listen to you. So it was more an affirmation that thank you so much. I think it's really rare to see somebody be so open and ponderous in a public forum, and I really, really enjoyed what you're doing and the situations that you describe, and the lack of conclusions, which I think is again really exciting. Yes, so thank you so very much. Fantastic work.
Thank you.
Thank you for provoking and.
Thanks so much for coming, Saskia. Saskia runs our foundation course at the AA. So
many things resonate. I sort of think maybe you should firmly go on a list for external examiner if you ever had the time.
It's already happened.
Okay. Well, that's good. It would be lots of things resonate as kind of lots of things really resonate. And lots of conversations to have, lots of provocations. I think I've got lots of things that I'd like to tell you about that might be interesting for you to go and explore, but we'll do that in another forum. But mainly just fantastic, and thank you so much. It's a real big gift at a moment like this. So thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
That was a much better expressed thank you than mine. So I think I'm really even happier that Saskia got to say that. And maybe just before we end, I'll try and do a mass unmute so you can get as close to a round of applause as you can get on Zoom. Okay, I've asked everyone to unmute. So.
Oh, thank you.